Good morning and welcome to WITA. We're delighted you could join us for today's timely event. Before we get to today's event, though, a few notes on upcoming activities at WITA. Yesterday, we announced an event for the week after Thanksgiving with our good friends at the Asia Society Policy Institute to look at what's next for IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, following the APEC summit that is taking place this week. That event will take place on Wednesday, November 30th. Information can be found on our website, www.wita.org. You can also find information about how to support WITA in 2024 there. And keep an eye on that page as well for a special event in December, looking back at 250 years since the Boston Tea Party, which first made trade a flashpoint in American politics, even before there was a United States. And if you've watched any of our more than 250 webinars since 2020, you know we like to call out the names of some of those who are with us online, but you can't see on Zoom. So welcome today to Christy Bliss at the Coalition of Service Industries, Ed Britswa at the Consumer Technology Association, Marianne Rowden at the E-Merchants Trade Council, and Jordan Haas at Intel. Welcome, Christy, Ed, Marianne, and Jordan, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching today on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and Josh will try to weave as many of those as he can into our discussion. You should have also received our speakers' biographies by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. Today, we welcome several new speakers to the WITA webinar platform. Firstly, welcoming Eric Adams, the founder and CEO of Dog and Whistle. Very interested in learning more about your business, Eric. Christine Bannan, U.S. Public Policy Manager at Proton, where I just opened my own first Proton email account. Sean Heather, a Senior Vice President for International Regulatory Affairs and Antitrust at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And Melinda St. Louis, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Welcome, Eric, Christine, Sean, and Melinda. And welcome to our moderator, good friend of WITA, Josh Meltzer, a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Josh is also the founder of PolicyWare, a partner with WITA, the WITA Academy, that offers short courses, they call them deep dives, on key trade topics. They have one coming up on China's digital governance featuring Sam Sachs of Yale University. Information on all PolicyWare programs can also be found on our event page and WITA's website. Welcome back, Josh, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you for joining us for today's panel.
Thanks, Ken. Great to be here again, and another very timely webinar and topic for discussion. We've got a great set of panelists. We've got where we're going to be focusing on developments in the digital trade space. As I think everyone online is aware, this has been a core part of the US trade agenda for many years now, building out first e-commerce chapters and now what digital trade chapters, probably the most robust being the one in the USMCA. And notwithstanding having pulled out of the CPTPP, the IPEF discussions were to be a place where one would have expected ongoing engagement on digital trade rules, as well as in the WTO JSI e-commerce discussions. But things seem to have changed a little as of late. So we're here to discuss where we're at and what has happened and what's happening, what's driving those changes. But I think it might just be helpful to level set the conversation to understand exactly where we think the government is at, where USTR is at in particular, but the government more broadly on e-commerce and digital trade rules. So I'd like to open it up to the panelists just to provide their assessment of what the state of play currently is with respect to US policy ambition towards digital trade rules, whether in the WTO or IPEF or in other forum. Sean, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I think that while USTR did withdraw text at the WTO, I don't know that in any way, shape, or form reflects a change fundamentally in US policy in this space. And I say that because I think USTR has put themselves on an island. When you go up to Capitol Hill and you see, for example, a letter Senator Warren tried to organize to rally the troops to show support for what USTR did, that letter fell flat. There's hardly anybody who signed it, and we even understand a couple of people signed it and didn't know what they signed and may regret having signed it. In contrast, you have large swaths of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle asking, what the hell did you guys just do? This doesn't make any sense. It's not in our national interest. Similarly, I can't find a single agency inside the administration who's willing to defend the position that USTR took. In fact, there's conversations about the fact that the interagency processes that went behind this that led up to the decision was short-circuited. Some have called it a shadowy process, but certainly other agencies who have lots to say about data flows, about pushing back on data localization, on protecting kind of algorithm source code information from being a condition for market access. Those kinds of policy positions are still very much what other parts of the U.S. government are advancing and talking about in their conversations with our foreign trading partners. So we've seen the public spat from the White House, where there's certainly, I think, an active conversation going on as to what happens next. I think we're all going to have to wait and see what happens next. But USTR has put themselves on an island, and I don't think there's deep support. And I think that's where we stand today.
Okay, so a couple of issues there it might be worth unpacking. Part of it is USTR maybe on an island. What is that island in terms of what is USTR's position as we understand it with respect to existing ongoing discussions in the WTO or in IPEF? And Sean, you can come back in, but Melinda or Christine or Eric, if you want to proffer any views on that, the floor's open to you as well. Melinda.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for having me today. Public Citizen is focus on this issue has come from our work domestically in a number of coalitions that have been actively engaged in efforts to pass and enact comprehensive data privacy laws, competition legislation in the tech sector, and regulation to address AI discrimination and other harms. And we work with groups in the Global South that also have been grappling with regulation to protect the public in this rapidly transforming sector. And so, I think that what the Biden administration has done really is beginning to align our trade policy with the president, who has been very clear that the importance of regulating big tech and Congress's goals with regulating the sector, that our trade policy is in line with that. And these, I think what happened is simply a return to policy positions that the United States has long had, that actually what was in the USMCA was a new push that was being pushed by big tech companies. Most in Congress didn't even realize it was happening until after it was concluded. And so now I think as we're seeing that the administration is starting to really pay attention on domestic regulation in the sector and taking and addressing specific areas of the happy to go into what those things are in terms of pre-screening and audits of algorithms to ensure discrimination, that there is not discriminatory policy before there are harms, or making sure that we are able to protect consumer data. And obviously the major pushes that have happened in Congress and in the administration to protect consumer privacy and so forth. Those efforts have been actively opposed by a lot of the same actors who are now very upset about the new U.S. position around these issues in the WTO, JSI, and in the IPEF. So, I think the concerns have been very overblown. It's very sound policy, and and this is also my understanding is that it is part of an interagency discussion. Many of other agencies that care about protecting consumer privacy and so forth have been concerned about what the implications of these provisions should be. So, it's sound policy to be thoughtful about this, to step back from some of the most extreme provisions that were inserted into the USMCA, and to make sure that the Biden administration is making sure that they are aligning their domestic policy goals, the goals that we have in supporting protecting consumers in other countries as well, with our trade policy.
Great. There's a lot there, Melinda, and that's a very helpful, I think, kind of laying out of the concerns of what digital policy in trade agreements may have that intersection with domestic policy, what it may or may look like. But I do want to get back to just a clear level set on what actually we understand the position now of the USTR, at least with respect to digital trade rules. As I understand it, it's not a full backing away from the digital trade agenda. It may be focused on the data flow, data localization commitments primarily, but others may have more detailed kind of insights on where USTR stands on just this piece, so then we can build on that. So I just want to open up the floor to see if anyone wants to agree with me or kind of add to what they understand the USTR position to be currently.
I'll just jump back in there and just say that my understanding is, yes, in fact, this is not an abandoning of the talks. They're engaged in continuing to engage in the JSI e-commerce talks, continuing to engage in digital trade negotiations, but are stepping back from some of the provisions that have been most controversial and that could really impact the policy space to regulate in the sector. So the ones that you mentioned, but the source code provision, my understanding, is also a big part of that, and some of the non-discrimination provisions as well, because they were so broad that they would catch a lot of really important public policy proposals that are on the table in the US and in other countries to regulate this rapidly transforming sector. I mean, obviously every day we are seeing more examples of, emerging AI technologies, potential harms, discrimination, that has come out. And so it's really important to protect that space. And so I think, yes, stepping back from some of these most radical and problematic proposals, but yes, staying engaged in the process and so forth. So, I think that's my understanding.
I don't speak for USTR. I won't try to. I think USTR is having problems articulating what they did and what they believe and where things are headed next. And so I think we just all need to watch the space.
Okay. I definitely want to get into, so the concerns that you've raised, Melinda, about how some of these commitments may constrain sort of some of the domestic policy space to do these other regulations. But before we get there, I just want to actually ask another foundational question to the group, which is what has been the economic drivers, the reasons for USTR and broader US government support for these digital trade rules in terms of its, there's been, I think, a range of reasons and evidence that have been around the importance of data flows and no data localization for a whole range of companies across the US economy. And I just wonder if whether Eric or Christine or Sean or Melinda want to kind of elaborate on what they understood the positive kind of economic drivers of these data flow and other commitments of digital trade agreements have been to date, at least. Eric.
In my opinion, yes. In my opinion, I think it's more just on the analytics of, from my standpoint, the analytics and the understanding of who my customer is. That can also drive the increase the retention aspect of it, right? When it looks to using it as a positive tool, then you're able to build that hospitality, as I would like to say, within the companies, to where you can continue to understand the logistics of what their pet needs or what that customer needs is, and it increases, more organic traffic or organic flow towards the business itself.
It might just be actually helpful for me, and I'm sure for the audience, to just give a 2-minute what is your business, and that might help us understand how you use data and the data analytics you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dog and Whistle is actually a e-commerce platform where we actually provide upcycled foods to pet parents. So we rescue our foods from distributors and restaurant partners, and we distribute nationwide. So single ingredient lot of byproducts from the foreign markets as well. So we spent grains, rescue.
Eric, I think we missed a little of that. There was just a couple of breaks in your presentation, but I think I got the gist of this being an e-commerce platform. You're operating domestically, you're sourcing globally, and just from that premise, how are you using data in your business? And I guess it'd be really interesting to kind of pick up on. You seem to be suggesting that the data flows. Let's leave aside the policy piece for the moment. Just from a business perspective, you've got a cross-border data flow piece to your business that you use. If you could just talk about that, that'd be great.
Yes, sorry about that. So sorry about that breaking up.
Yeah.
So it actually shares logistical operations. So understanding in terms of my customer, the analytics aspect of it, understanding the needs of the customers. So as for one, through the provisions that it is confidential, it helps align the understanding of that customer. From my aspect. And then also it also helps in terms of the analytics or the resourcing of where we can share what we receive our fruits and our vegetables from. So that way our customers are able to look and see where that item is being locally sourced from, nationally sourced from, or globally sourced from. Okay,
that's very helpful. Thanks, Eric. So I think we have a set. I think that it's interesting because there's these rules on data flows have had somewhat of a long history. They obviously started. I think our first auto commitment was in the Chorus Decree US FTA on data flows, and then the real full blown development happened originally in the TPP, which became the CPTPP. So this is now during the Obama years, where there was obviously a long negotiation and an engagement with Congress on all these issues and a finalization of the text. And there was obviously the decision by President Trump to pull the US out of the CPTPP in his first week in office, but we presumably had a fairly extensive sort of interagency process, as well as engagement with Congress, developing those commitments. USMCA largely picked up on those commitments, strengthened them in a couple of areas, but that was reflected in the USMCA agreement. So there is a fairly extensive history to US engagement on these trade rules. And I think, an important set of developments economically around, I think to your point, Eric, how small businesses have been using data flows to kind of enable them to trade and operate globally. So it is a pretty big sort of change. I think it's unclear exactly how significant the change is and how long lasting the change will be. I think that's probably a matter for discussion and debate. But it might be interesting, I think, to get into, and Melinda, you've laid out, I think, a really important range of concerns around what these digital trade rules might mean for the capacity to achieve other goals, right? And I think you've listed a couple of them. One was competition policy. I think you had another around regulation of artificial intelligence. There might be a couple more. Consumer protection, I think, was another one. And Christine, I know you're thinking about this a bit from a competition perspective. I don't know if I can bring you in to sort of kind of articulate a little bit around that.
Yes, please. I'll just give a quick intro on Proton for those that aren't familiar. So we are a privacy technology company. We're most known for Proton Mail, which is the largest end-to-end encrypted email service, meaning that only the recipient of your email has access to the contents. But we now have a suite of privacy tools like VPN, file storage, password manager. So we offer kind of a version of internet services that are not based on monetizing consumer data through advertising, which is a lot of the predominant way that big tech, particularly business model, works. And we've gotten involved in this advocacy through the antitrust and competition side. So we support US policies and international policies that would regulate the self-preferencing practices of the big tech gatekeepers. So in the US, that's the American Innovation and Choice Online Act and the Open App Markets Act. And there are similar policies internationally, both that have been enacted and that are under consideration. And what we've seen with this trade agreement is there is an effort to set a global low standard for competition policy that prevents future regulation of these sorts of monopolistic app store practices. So we are part of the Coalition for App Fairness, a group of developers that has confronted with these policies from Google and Apple. And we sent a letter this week to the Biden administration expressing support for this decision, specifically on the language around non-discrimination in terms of competition policy. So the language that was in the agreement framed discrimination, not in terms of national origin, like as written, but in effect. So that means that if neutrally facial laws based on objective criteria predominantly apply to American companies with this way that is written, that would be considered discrimination based on national origin, meaning that it was discriminating based on a company being American versus not. But that is really not how trade policy has worked before USMCA. It should be based on intentional discrimination on national origin. We have no problem with that policy, but the issue is when you are trying to regulate digital gatekeepers, there are a few companies that are much larger and have much more market power. And when you write criteria neutrally, it's going to apply more to those. And we shouldn't use the trade agreements shouldn't be used to prevent Congress and other countries' legislators from looking at this gatekeeper power. So that's our perspective from competition, that we want trade agreements to be promoting more innovation, more competition from different digital companies, and not restricting it to these few dominant players.
Thank Christine, that's great, and I love how you've just gone deep into the legal technicalities of non-discrimination. I wasn't sure if we wanted to go there, but you've opened that door, so that's fantastic. That's very helpful to really kind of provide a perspective on the competition side. Sean, I want to turn to you shortly, but can I just before
Please, go for it.
Just let me bring Melinda. I'm not sure if you want to add to anything Christine just said. Let's just maybe focus on the competition piece, because I think each issue probably deserves a little bit of its own attention. So is there anything more you want to say on where you see the conflict between these digital trade rules and then competition specifically?
Well, I would say, in addition to what Christine shared, which we also, consumer groups have also weighed in with similar concerns, and Public Citizen is also part of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, which is a coalition, an alliance of more than 70 consumer and public interest organizations on both sides of the Atlantic, and around some of these same concerns, because we also know that the big tech companies have been really taking aim at Europe's attempts to hold the large platforms accountable, and have kind of been pointing to some of these same things. And we believe that in the United States, those of us who have been working in the US to try to not necessarily emulate exactly the way that they're doing in Europe, but we recognize that we have a problem in the US in terms of competition policy in the sector, and have efforts to, legislative efforts to try to get over the finish line. And again, we have bipartisan support for that, and it has not gotten over the finish line, largely because of, some of the lobbying internally. So I would say that, we share that. In addition, I think that, I mentioned the source code provisions, which we can talk to around like the discrimination piece, but there's also a serious competition issue there, I think, because as we're seeing the, source code and algorithms for AI, AI products as they're rapidly deploying. We need to be able, regulators need to be able to scrutinize that source code to ensure that there isn't anti-competitive behavior happening, and that by having the provision written the way that it was, that basically only allows regulators to step in when a specific action is taking place. That means they don't actually know until the harm is taken place. That there needs to be an audit or a scrutiny of the source code and algorithm. So in addition to some of the other public harms, we're also concerned there around competition.
Great. Sean, I'll turn it over to you. I'd love you to pick up on, as I ask you to provide your perspective on this, the national treatment commitment in particular, as you know, has been around in trade agreements since the WTO, and what is it about national treatment in this digital trade context that is different? And it'd be, I think, helpful to kind of expand this discussion into also the role of the exceptions provision and the policy space that provides, because it seems to me that we need to look at the broader kind of balance that the trade agreements strike to kind of get a sense of where the flexibility may or may not be lacking in terms of what governments can or cannot do.
Yeah, I think just listening to the conversation here, what is clear is that the kind of contempt that some of my fellow panelists have for a handful of companies that they label as big tech, quite frankly, blinds the conversation as to what digital trade provisions are really all about. The Chamber and some nearly 50 other trade associations talked about just how important data flows are to the rest of our economy, that these digital trade rules that came out of TPP, as you explained, were not written as special interest provisions for 4 or 5 big tech companies. They were written because every company in every industry today is relying on digital tools. And in fact, services today are growing exponentially because they're now digitally enabled. People like Eric are able to reach customers around the world because of things like data flows. So we can have a conversation about what is necessary for regulating the digital transformation of the economy, and whether or not tech companies, we need to update our regulatory models. But it has nothing to do with trade. We've had competition enforcement. Europe for years went after big tech companies, Microsoft, Intel, the list goes on. Nobody stopped Europe from doing any of those things as a quote unquote discriminatory matter. It wasn't a violation of national treatment. Certainly the DOJ and FTC are bringing cases here in the United States under our antitrust law that proceed without any kind of concern associated with a violation of commitments the United States has made internationally. Privacy was mentioned. Well, GDPR is probably one of the most sweeping, forward-leaning privacy laws in the entire world. It is not being challenged as a conflict with any kind of trade commitment. And when folks talk about the digital trade rules and talk about this idea of discrimination, they're really attacking national treatment. National treatment isn't confined to the digital trade chapter. National treatment has been around for decades. It's core to all trade agreements. It's the idea that foreigners should be treated, on par with domestic companies. And so when we start talking about things like the DMA, there are legitimate concerns that it violates one's trade commitment. Why? Well, because the DMA is not like GDPR. GDPR applies to everybody. Everybody's expected to compete with the same kind of understanding about protecting consumers' privacy. That's not what the DMA says. If self-preferencing is a bad thing, why is it bad when some people do it but not others? And when all of a sudden you start to arbitrarily draw lines and you say only it applies to these companies and foreign companies, that becomes a problem. You look at, for example, people who are upset about the way Amazon as a platform treats small businesses. Well, guess what? We can have a conversation about a small business bill of rights when it comes to e-commerce platforms. But if we do that, it doesn't have to apply just to Amazon. It should apply to all e-commerce platforms. So, there is plenty of space for these conversations to happen in the United States, to happen in Europe, to happen in Japan, to happen anywhere in the world. And trade rules don't interfere with making those kinds of societal decisions. But what trade rules do ensure is that when a government decides to inject itself into these conversations, it doesn't do so in a way that singles out the foreigners. That's not part of the digital trade rules that USTR was talking about. I don't think USTR has stood up at the WTO and said, we renounce national treatment. So, if we're going to talk about the digital trade provisions, national treatment wasn't invented in USMCA. It wasn't invented in the phase 1 text with Japan. It wasn't invented as part of the digital trade provisions in TPP. National treatment is at the heart of every trade agreement. It's at the heart of every understanding countries have bound themselves to for a very long time. That's not new. And there's plenty of space to have conversations about regulating in response to digital transformation. And trade is not the blocker for those conversations.
I think Christine and then Melinda want to come back in. Christine.
Yeah, great, thanks. So yeah, I'll say, even in your characterization, Digital Markets Act is a barrier to trade. So I think trade is being used to block these regulations. The Digital Markets Act applies to American companies. It also applies to the Chinese company TikTok, ByteDance, and starting in January, it will apply to the European company Booking once it meets these objective financial thresholds. So competition
Booking
policy,
is a U.S. company, by the record. Booking is headquartered in the United States. The parent company is a U.S. company.
Well, it is the point is that
Booking is a U.S. company. They are a holding company for properties, and they are a U.S. company.
The point is that there's objective criteria based on users, based on financial thresholds that are being met, that is the basis for competition policy. So even our Sherman, Antitrust Act, when antitrust enforcers bring enforcement actions, it's based on a combination of market power plus monopolistic behavior. One without the other isn't a violation of antitrust laws. And these new policies that are being considered in the US and around the world use that two-pronged approach of both having the market power plus the conduct. So that's nothing new. And I think it's really a understanding of where innovation comes from, that American innovation and innovation generally is based exclusively and primarily in the biggest companies. In order for there to be more value brought to the end user, there has to be robust competition among different firms in the digital market.
Christine, that's very helpful. I don't think we need to get into a debate about the merits of competition policy per se. I think that there may be a lot more agreement on the importance of competition as a drivers of innovation. But it'd be great to just keep the focus on what it is about the trade rules that prevents effective antitrust policy in the US. And Christine, happy for you to come back in on that. I know you've talked about the non-discrimination clause, but Melinda, let's over to you.
Yeah, no, I would just say that I think that, again, just bringing up the concept of national treatment, that's not what is specifically in this provision. The concern around the provision is that it is defined in a way that is, as Christine mentioned, that is policies that are in effect as opposed to it, and those that are facially neutral. And when you're talking about competition policy, like, and again, we don't need to debate the DMA, go deeply into debating the DMA, but there are objective criteria. It just so happens that the largest gatekeepers are these companies. That is not a specific discrimination against U.S. companies. If any company that meets those thresholds will be bound by the DMA. And we know, these companies are not happy about being regulated in this way. They don't want that to happen in the US. So they will use any tool that they have, obviously, to challenge it. And so, that's, so that I think is really what's going on here. And so for those of us. So again, it matters what the language of these provisions are. I wouldn't say that this is about contempt for particular industries, but it's about who had influence, who was paying attention to these provisions when they were initially put in. You were correct, during the TPP and then during the USMCA. This was not a bunch of very small companies that were doing that. They were not engaged directly in those negotiations. There were trade associations that were, and they were pushing, particular interests. And so as you know, in trade law, what's written in the language matters. And that's what the concerns are. And that's what the concerns have been from the consumer community and from those who've been care about, regulating in the sector. And yeah, I mean, again, this is all very new. The technology is rapidly transforming and so forth. And so tying our hands at this point through the way these provisions were written doesn't make sense. And, and I think that's what the administration has come to. It's time to, be more thoughtful about this. We're all paying attention in a different way than we were 10 years ago around these issues. And so it's time to revisit it.
That's helpful, Melinda. I guess maybe what I'd like to ask anyone on the panel is to, when thinking about where they think that the trade rules are limiting in terms of policy space, to also bring in the conversation around the way the exceptions provisions work, because as I'm sure everyone knows, all of these commitments on data flows and no data localization, certainly on non-discrimination, are also paired with both a national security and a general exception provision, which allow governments then to essentially discriminate in order to achieve a whole range of public policy goals, which would certainly include consumer protection, competition policy, and privacy. And why that doesn't provide the flexibility. I think this is kind of probably Sean's point, that essentially the rules are designed with enough policy space and flexibility to go and achieve these other regulatory goals. And what is it about the current set of domestic goals that you've articulated, and I think a lot of people understand and support, that are being constrained by the current setup with the trade rules that includes the exceptions provisions?
If I could jump in there, the first thing I would say is that when you have to, every iteration, you see kind of more exceptions put in, and that is partially because it is impossible, because of this rapidly developing technology, to actually know what are all of the policy areas that you're going to need to have space for to regulate. But I will also say that my understanding is that on the data flows, the public policy exceptions that have been put in there largely replicate the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and Trade exceptions, general exception. And that exception has extreme limitations. That what Public Citizen did an analysis of all of the times that countries have attempted to use the GATT exception, the general exception, and only in 46 of the 48 cases, they were not successful in utilizing the exception to be able to protect their policy space. So we don't feel confident at all in the exception, the general exception that has been replicated in language from that, again, in the USMCA and the source code provision, the exception is for a specific investigation that's undertaken. That's when the government can require the disclosure of source code. Well, as I mentioned, there are many other reasons that it's important to be able to scrutinize the source code before there is a specific legal action against them, because that's when you've already allowed for tremendous harm to happen through discrimination or other types of harms that we are starting to see more and more of, especially with the emerging AI technologies. So yeah, I mean, we also have looked at the exceptions, and when you have to keep listing exceptions to exceptions, we obviously want to strengthen them if they're going to be in there, and that's a good reason to be taking a step back now and reassessing. But also, for some particular rules, and I mean, I think it's wrong to equate data flow, the fact that data needs to flow, with these specific data flow rules. I think that is often kind of just thrown around as the reason that we have data flows is because of these provisions. I mean, the US is not in TPP. Also, the EU has not been challenged for the GDPR in the same way because they haven't actually signed up to these provisions, with the United States or elsewhere. And so that's why you're seeing the European Union and the JSI negotiations having a different position around the data flows, but to protect the GDPR. So that's why, I think it's important to be for the Biden administration's position now was sensible public policy.
Christine, just back on the competition piece, you talked about the discrimination angle and why you thought that piece was problematic. I'm not sure. I mean, someone should go and write a paper on this. So it'd be interesting to, I think, identify the types of antitrust action that could be feasible that would clash, I think, with the exceptions provision. I don't know if you have a view on sort of various approaches to competition policy once you look at the exceptions kind of provisions that would be constraining at all. I mean, I take your point, Melinda, about having looked at, I don't actually have the data on how many exception provisions have been won or lost, but the jurisprudence has really certainly interpreted that in a pretty broad way. And often the cases that, as you know, go to the WTO are the ones that governments are most confident that they're going to win, and the exceptions, the cases that don't get through the exception provision are often caught for genuinely discriminatory reasons. But that's I think a longer conversation. But it'd be interesting to know what's if you have a sense of the antitrust enforcement that the US might like to do that would not get through the current set of trade rules that would justify a change.
Yeah. I think in terms of the U.S., I think the issue is legislation. It's possible that enforcement actions could be constrained, but the real issue, I think, is with future legislation in the U.S. Related to the app stores and with general self-preferencing practices. Internationally, we have seen, some of the IPEF countries like South Korea pass the world's first law specific to the app stores in 2021. And, we are concerned that under this policy, this trade policy, that those sorts of laws in other countries wouldn't be able or would be considered restraints on trade because they're applicable to the two app stores, which are Google and Apple. So that's what we're thinking of internationally.
Yeah, I think it's Sean. You seem to want to come in here.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think Christine is right in the sense that there is nothing about trade that is going to prevent FTC or DOJ or any agency around the world to bring a specific enforcement action. That those are all ex post law enforcement exercises, which trade has never interfered with. Christine is right. The conversation and debate, to the degree we're going to have it, is on ex ante regulatory approaches that kind of circumvent the real kind of thoughtful analysis that goes into specific antitrust enforcement measures on an ex post basis. Then the problem with those ex ante rules is that objective criteria, which I heard Melinda try to say, well, these are objective. Objective criteria can be discriminatory. I can write an objective criteria that says we're only going to do certain things for dog owners. It's objective. If you don't own a dog, you don't get these privileges. I can go and discriminate against cat owners. It's objective. And so the national treatment obligation in trade agreements, which has nothing to do with digital, it extends across the entire agreement, is one that doesn't just kind of give governments an easy way out that says, well, just because you come up with some objective criteria, suddenly you don't have to defend what you've done against a national treatment type challenge. So look, this has nothing to do with ex post enforcement. It has everything to do with ex ante regulation. The agenda that Proton pushes here in Washington is very clear. They want to see these bills up on Capitol Hill become law. It's very clear that the agenda of Public Citizen has long been against everything that's happened in the trade space, and so now that the digital economy is out there, it's a new talking point. But at the core of this, it's what is the role of national treatment? And That is at the center of and heart of all of this. And I think, there's a bunch of conversations in the chat from people who are actually trade lawyers who know how the exemptions work, know that there's lots of exemptions that come into play, and they're nowhere near as limited as this panel would like folks to believe. And the last thing I'll say is, look, if self-preferencing is a bad thing, why not require all companies and be prohibited from it? Why is it only bad if it's one company? Look, there is a conversation to be had about app stores and app developers. And you can write a policy that says this is what the relationship should be between app stores and app developers. You just can't say that there's only two companies that have to abide by it. There are other app stores out there. There are other app platforms out there. So you can have these conversations. You just cannot, from a trade perspective, say we're only going to apply it to 2 or 3 companies because we found some objective criteria. Once again, objective criteria can be as discriminatory as anything else. I don't like cats, so I'm going to write things that prohibit things that cat owners can and cannot do. So it's not just about making objective criteria. It's much more complicated analysis that goes into these national treatment debates.
Thanks, Jordan.
Let me just respond for a second. I mean, I think to say that it makes absolute sense from a competition policy to have different criteria for the largest platforms. That is the position. It is not about national treatment and about discriminating specifically against it. I feel like that, I think there are a lot of red herrings that get thrown out in the criticisms around this because the platforms don't want to be regulated in the way that Congress and that the President Biden has made clear, and so forth. And so I think that it is, obviously it's unsurprising that they're concerned about this, because this is about actually the United States government and governments around the world starting to really pay attention to the harms that can happen to the public. And I also just, I just feel like I need to take issue with the characterization of this being another talking point for Public Citizen. Public Citizen is part of a number of coalitions that are working domestically with civil rights organizations, with organized labor, with others that are working on the domestic issues around how we regulate big tech in the sphere. We've convened, a number of tables that are about emerging AI technologies and how we need to regulate them in the United States. And so this is, and many of our allies in Europe and elsewhere are focused on how we regulate and how, and there is serious concern. And it's not just us. It is the Biden administration's position now to take a step back and to look at how these digital trade provisions that, again, not restricting trade, but what are the specific relevant provisions and what the impacts are going to be. It's really important now for us to, the stakes are too high to just copy and paste something that was like put in the USMCA under the Trump administration. It's time to take a step back and take stock, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah, so that's helpful, Melinda and Sean, and I think that clarifies the debate a bit. It seems that one of the areas that we do need sort of clarity is the scope of flexibilities that the trade rules do or do not provide governments, because I think this balancing between commitments to non-discrimination or data flows or even access to source code are always cabined with very extensive exceptions provisions. I think getting this balance right between space for domestic regulation, which is discriminatory, and the trade rules to non-discrimination has been central to the debate around trade rules for a long time. And I think people generally are on board with this notion that you need an appropriate balance, you need appropriate flexibility. And I take your point, Melinda, that we're in a challenging regulatory environment when it comes to technology, and we want to make sure that we're not unnecessarily constraining that regulatory space. So I think the core question is it actually in fact constrained by the trade rules, and if so, how? And I think at the end of the day, there needs to be a deeper understanding of probably how the exception provisions would or wouldn't work. Maybe we.
Well, as I said, we did look at the general exception. And in 46 out of 48 cases that where the government was trying to defend its policy using the exception, it was not successful. So that is not going to, that construction, those types of constructions that we're seeing in these, with the digital trade rules is not comforting. And that's why we feel like it's extremely important to ensure that we get this right.
Yeah, and I think that's a helpful data point. I actually honestly don't have the data in front of me about how many of these exception provision cases have been won or lost, but I think it'd be helpful to actually identify, because government should at times lose cases. It's not an open exception provision that justifies anything and everything. There are constraints around how you use the exception provision, and you will lose some cases. I think the question should still be, what would the exception provision constrain the US government from doing when it comes to competition policy? It might be helpful to actually dig into the source code bit, because you've raised it a bit, Melinda, in the context of AI regulation, and you've talked about the construction which speaks specifically to the circumstances where the government can actually require access to source code. So that, in a sense, is a flexibility built into the source code provision. But as you noted, it's limited. But then it's paired as well with the general exceptions provision as well. Jonathan McHale has raised that. I've actually just released a paper on AI in trade, so this is a debate which is really interesting. But when you look at the source code piece combined with the general exceptions provision, does that still give you pause when it comes to what the government may be doing on AI regulation?
Well, when we're, again, you're saying sometimes the government should lose, but I'm talking about more than 90% of the time, 90% of the time they have lost under the general exception. So pairing that with the general exception is not, as I mentioned, I don't think that is sufficient. And, I think that it is, we are seeing legislation on the table that is about making sure, that is about ensuring that we can actually have audits of algorithms, pre-screening of algorithms for, to ensure that there will not be discrimination. Those would not be allowed under the exception that where you have a specific judicial action against it. And then, yeah, I know, then you're saying, okay, then you have the general exception. But as I mentioned, that has not been considered to be.
With all due respect, you're wrong. You can pass a law today in the United States or any country that for algorithms related to, let's say lending and finance, that they have to go through an audit process. That would not be violative of what was in USMCA or in TPP. Why? Because domestic companies have to go through that same thing as foreign companies. So the idea that, one would have to, show their algorithms in order before they could, enter the market. As long as the market in this context is not the market as a foreigner versus a domestic player. The market is the marketplace for using your AI, that might harm consumers. So you can put in place regulatory policies on auditing AI before it's actually used. And trade agreements written in the past, ones that are being talked about today, would not interfere with that. What you cannot do, though, is say to somebody, listen, if you want access to my market, I want to see your algorithm so that I might be able to then get access to your intellectual property, and it might leak out to competitors domestically that would then somehow be able to compete back against you. So that's what the trade provision prevents. If everybody has to go to the government and say, here's what my algorithms do, and there's an audit process before they can be used, that's no longer discriminatory. So these conversations, I have never said anywhere.
I actually, Sean, I think you are wrong. That this is not, the source code provision is not about discrimination. It is about whether the company needs to disclose its source code, whether it's domestic or foreign, and the foreign company can say that is a violation of the source code provision. You're conflating the national treatment and the source code provision.
The general exception would apply in the case of a government who has decided that for a particular use of AI that's high risk, that they want to perform audits on the front end. That's what the general exemption is there for. And to simply go off and say, well, in the 50 cases we studied, 48 of them or whatever, the government lost, you have to look at each of those cases. Perhaps the government should have lost. Certainly the United States government hasn't lost those cases. The governments that have lost those cases, quite frankly, haven't been as careful in thinking about what they've done.
The U.S. has lost those cases. We have lost those cases. We lost the cases.
Not the 46 that you're leaning into.
Yes, we have. We lost the case around dolphin safe tuna. We lost around country of origin labeling, and we put the general exception forward for those.
We have lost cases. I'm not saying we haven't lost any cases. What I'm saying is you have to look at each of the cases individually and decide. I would beg to differ in the way in which you've analyzed those cases.
Okay, what I'd like to do, I mean, I think this is an important conversation. One of the implications, obviously, where the US ends up on this is what happens internationally. And Eric, I'd like to bring you back in possibly. I'm not sure if you've had experience bumping into other regulations that are happening, whether it's in Europe or China possibly or elsewhere, what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, so in terms of regulations, I actually had communications in what Japan's looking for from a trade standpoint. So from a sourcing, they're not looking at the traditional agriculture. The only thing that we're really allowed to ship over would just be more of the seafood aspects, right? So within their regulations, it's just what we're kind of hindered to. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me, just understanding, okay, if we're looking to export to different markets or specifically Japan, this is only what I can export to this area. So, but then when it comes to the database of the markets that we're using on Amazon, within US or Mexico or Canada, we still have the abilities to ship to those areas with no limitations and no regulations. So from an overseas standpoint, it was very eye-opening for me, especially as a small business, because a lot of small businesses, we don't know that until we actually have those conversations with those buyers or really dive deep into from a logistical standpoint, doing our due diligence through our provisions.
Yeah, that's actually very, very helpful and interesting. I would suggest, I mean, I think we're coming up to time. One of the things I've observed is when it comes to digital trade rules, undoubtedly there's big technology companies and one can have concern about those from a competition and consumer rights perspective. And I think there's a lot of probably common ground amongst parties there. There's, I think, a question, I think, Eric, you've been speaking to this around, at some level, like a lot of these digital trade rules are really there to support small businesses. Data flows, no data localization. A lot of these are regulations that large companies can navigate, small companies often can't. And so it's undoubtedly the case that when we think about a trade policy going forward with respect to digital trade rules, we need to widen the aperture and think not only about what this means for big technology companies, but certainly about small companies as well. And so there are real trade-offs in terms of, I think, how the government kind of moves forward on this space. And it seems to me that there are genuine answers here if we can sort of sit down and analyze carefully the types of regulations we might think the US government wants to engage in broadly on consumer protection, regulation, privacy, and where we think that the trade rules are generally constraining when we look at the broad suite of, commitments and exceptions. I think going beyond, there's a number on how many cases have been won and lost, but actually looking at what the disciplines are and mean and where they would be genuinely constraining, I think would help clarify the position, because I think ultimately there's a lot of agreement actually on the need for policy space and flexibility. I think the question is it there or is it not there? And I think there's actually an answer to that. If we just have a careful look at what we think the suite of regulations that one might want on the table and where the trade rules would actually apply or not apply.
If I could just jump in, I absolutely agree. And I think that's exactly what the Biden administration is doing now. They want to actually look at the suite of regulations and policies, that proposals that are on the table, and ensure that the trade rules aren't restricting that space. And so, I think that's exactly what's happening. That's why we think it's wise for them to do that.
Sure. Anyone, I want to just give the panelists a 30-second opportunity for a 30-second conclusion, then I'll turn it over to Heather. Christine, any final comments?
I'll just say, as I've seen in the chat a bit, that we do support, the true meaning of national treatment, which is not discriminating on digital products based on their country of origin. We don't believe in this new concept of national treatment that has been that the Biden administration has withdrawn support for. We think that this decision is consistent with the Biden administration's goals of promoting competition policy and more fair and equitable digital markets that are better for user privacy.
Great, thanks. Melinda, Sean, I'm Eric. I'm assuming you've had your final say, but Sean, any last words from you?
No, I just would thank Ken and WITA for pulling this all together, and Josh for the job you did in moderating the conversation. And I think we ended on a good note, which is I think we all agree that there is an appropriate space for public policy discussions that trade should not interfere with. And I just think that the folks, unfortunately, on this panel aren't necessarily as familiar with trade agreements and trade law and the way in which provisions across an agreement work together to ensure that that policy space is reserved. So whatever we see next out of USTR, I think they still very much support national treatment. And I suspect that they will once again return to the conversation about supporting data flows and opposing data localization, those kinds of things. So I think that's the long-term trajectory of where this conversation ultimately is headed.
Ken, over to you.
I guess I shouldn't be surprised when the Chamber and Public Citizen are sometimes at odds on how they view the world, and so but appreciate having both of you on, and Eric and Christine bringing your unique perspectives and insights where your companies are coming from, and how the impacts of these things are so widely felt across society, from both an individual user standpoint, but for small businesses and large businesses, for tech companies, for non-tech companies. There's so many facets to this, and it's such a complicated space. And I feel like sometimes when we have these conversations at WITA, sometimes we answer questions, and sometimes when we ask these questions, we get complicated answers that lead to complicated questions. And I don't know that we always end up with a simple answer, and I think that's where we are right now. So I think there's still a lot of policy space we need to discuss here at WITA. So grateful to all of you for joining us for this on a Friday morning before a holiday. So thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to the new folks. Thanks to people who've been part of the WITA world for a long time for being here. We're not going to see anybody else online before the U.S. holiday. So happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Hope everybody has a safe, if they're traveling, that they stay safe. And we hope to see you back after the holiday when we'll be talking about IPEF. And I think some of these issues may come back up again in that conversation as well. So thank you all very much. Take care, and everyone be safe.